get started here. I'm sure we'll have additional folks joining in, but we'll just get this kicked off. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Roundtable. This program will focus on the opportunities and challenges LA Public Schools and enrollment post-COVID. My name is Lyle Janisek, and I am an Associate Regional Planner at SCAG, and I will be assisting with today's program. The format of today's roundtable will be a presentation from our guest speaker, followed by a question and answer session. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And at the Q&A session, I will bring up the questions that were left in the chat box, as well as we'll open the call to all participants who would like to join in an open conversation. Today, I'm very excited to introduce you to our guest speaker, Mary Pritchard. Ms. Pritchard currently serves as a demographic research and planning analyst for the Master Planning and Demographics Unit of the Los Angeles Unified School District. The unit's function is to support the LAUSD's mission through production of short and long-range enrollment forecasts, management of the district's annual school-by-school enrollment planning process, management of the district's annual facilities capacity and enrollment process, applied K-12 demographic analyses, attendance boundary management, and production of official district mapping. Ms. Pritchard is involved in multiple aspects of the unit's operations, including strategic planning, project development and management, data-driven analyses, data management, and quality control. She has extensive experience with enrollment forecasting, capacity planning, analytic techniques, database development and management, confidential data management protocols, process documentation, and working in a GIS environment. Ms. Pritchard served for a number of years in adjunct faculty positions for community colleges, as well as CSU Los Angeles. She served as president of the Los Angeles Geographical Society and as a career mentor for the Association of American Geographers. Her research has been presented at professional conferences, including the Association of American Geographers and Population Association of America annual conferences. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in geography from Cal State Los Angeles. Without further ado, I'll turn the table over to Mary Pritchard.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I am pleased to be back. I do hold these roundtables, seems annually, and fortunately for us at the LAUSD, the SCAG USC Demographic Conference or workshops have invited us back annually to provide the perspective of K-12 education in each of these years that the workshop has been held, and explores what kind of demographic economic changes our state, and in particular for LAUSD, the Southern California area, has been experiencing. Today, I will be talking about enrollments, both pre-COVID and post-COVID and COVID. And I'd like to begin by taking a quick poll to see which sectors the participants, you participants, are involved with. And so if you would, please answer these general questions so that I have a sense of which sectors are being represented here in the roundtable. And once we have that, okay, great. So I see 11% education, 1 out of 9. So we have 9 people joining. And then the rest of you are in some form of government work. And then if you would, the next question, which asks if the sector you worked in, yes, has been affected by COVID. In education, those who are joining us say about a quarter of you, 30%, are saying yes, it has. I believe that's what it's saying, and government about 7. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Now we're at the second. Yes, so everybody says yes. So we all in this roundtable might have a great conversation about how COVID has affected the industries in which we work in, and because it looks like most of us have either are working in the educational field or in government, which public education sort of straddles the two. I'm hoping that you folks also will be able to enlighten me and the rest of us on your experiences with how COVID has affected the industry you're working in. Okay. I would like to begin by emphasizing that public education doesn't function in a vacuum. We are in public education reflect the societal events and the forces occurring at any one time and any point in time. In this case, the COVID pandemic is our case study for today, but for sure not the only event and larger force that impacts public school enrollments and to which public schools have to respond. So today is a time where we will look at the K-12 enrollments and the enrollment trends and be reminded that public education is where our nation's broader issues are intersecting and interplaying among students, their families, and all of us working at the school district. For this roundtable, I'm going to spend some time looking at some of the larger events and broader forces that have influenced enrollments over the long term and provide some detail on what we know so far about how COVID has impacted LAUSD enrollments. So let's begin by taking an overview of the LAUSD boundaries and the district relative to the nation and the LA County area. So in this map, we can see the delineated service area which the LAUSD serves. We, as a district, cover approximately 710 square miles of geographic area, which includes most of LA City and all or portions of 26 cities and unincorporated areas within Los Angeles County. The district remains the second largest employer in the County of Los Angeles. Notice that the district does not include portions of the county, particularly eastward. The city of Beverly Hills has their own school district right in the center of the district boundary. It is the second largest school district in the nation, serving over 600,000 students from preschool through adult ed. Over 80% of our students are identified as living in poverty. Approximately 74% identify as Latino, 10 or Latinx, 10% as white, 8% as African American, 5.5% as Asian or Filipino, less than 1% identifying as American Indian, Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. The LAUSD has built 136 new K-12 schools since 1997, and it continues to modernize and rehabilitate its facilities using voter-approved funding. The unit for which I work, which is the Master Planning and Demographics Unit, is responsible for supporting the district through the production of enrollment projections and birth projections, which we consider the demand side of the enrollment equation. We analyze operational capacity at school sites as it relates to enrollment, and we consider that the supply side of the equation. We manage the district's enrollment capacity and annual budgeting / enrollment online platform. We manage the attendance boundaries and running resident area analysis. We have a GIS component, so we run GIS analysis and mapping. And we manage the open enrollment program, which is a state mandated choice program. I will mention that our unit is going to be opening up positions. So if you know of any qualified people who might be interested in demographic research planning analyst positions or GIS tech positions, please keep your eye out on the LAUSD website, or you can contact me at least to let me know your interest, and I can be contacted at mary.pritchard, Prichard, at lausd.net, and I would forward that on. However, there is a prescribed way to apply and express interest. Okay. During today's roundtable presentation, I'll focus on the district enrollment trends and early signs of how COVID has affected public school enrollments, and I also will identify some of the opportunities and challenges we see ahead for public education. In this chart, we can see K-12 graded enrollments over a very long period of time, decades, in fact. When we look at enrollments in the long term, we can see troughs and peaks over the years. We can see that there was enrollment loss surrounding the 70s and what we might call the stagflation of the 70s. However, prior to this, and let me step back a moment, kindergarten enrollments are usually forecasted, and the effects of kindergarten enrollments is usually based in the births that happened 5 or 6 years prior, really 5 years prior. And so in the 70s, this enrollment decline is in part impacted by fertility declines. And what's interesting to note is in the 60s, the late 60s going into the 70s, total fertility rates in California dropped below 2.1, which is the replacement rate. Well, guess what? That's where we are these days. So we can see some impacts of stagflation and these larger forces on enrollments in the 70s. We can see that we have a bit of a blip during the Northridge earthquake. We can see a growth in enrollments throughout the 90s into the early 2000s when we peaked. And then we can see the decades-long decline stemming from these larger changes from the early 2000s to where we are today. What are those changes? We are, in a broad sense, we're looking at the birth rate declines. We're looking at changes in immigration policy, declines in housing affordability and general cost of living affordability, and subsequent shifts in localized, along with intra and interstate migration. I showed you the map just now of the LAUSD boundaries so that you could see that LAUSD doesn't serve the entire county. So even if families or households with children, K to 12 age children, migrate just east to Montebello or even further east, they are migrating outside of the LAUSD boundary and effectively removing their kids from our enrollments. So, so the district, LAUSD, is sensitive even to these more localized shifts in migration and people in search of perhaps more affordable housing and cost of living. As of 2020, we not only have these, much broader forces, but the enrollment challenges now include those posed by the COVID-induced illness, public policy surrounding COVID, and families' own decisions about enrolling their children. So this all resulted in a delay in enrolling their children in kindergarten this year, and other graded enrollment, specifically particular grades, and I'll go into that soon. And then in terms of where we go from here, We have a higher degree of unknowns about how enrollments will be affected as COVID continues to impact the health and welfare of our communities, as the economy opens up and adults are looking for work and need things such as affordable childcare options, as well as local, state, and federal policy shifts. So let's look specifically, and before I do that, I would like to point out here's our mid-90s to 2000 growth, and we had about a 16% growth in enrollments. But from the 2000s down to today, we've had even a greater loss in enrollments. And if you look at 23%, that's a very significant loss in the last 20 years. If we look at how those K-12 enrollments have shifted and also been affected by COVID, breaking them out into non-charter and fiscally independent charters, which I'll refer to as FICS, fiscally independent charter schools. We can see that the percent of the district's total K-12 graded enrollments, which are FICS enrollments, have been flattening over time. So they were growing much more in the mid-2000s. And then as we get closer to this current year, the growth has been flattening, or at least the proportion of FICS enrollments relative to the district's total enrollments has been lessening. And however, this year they still did take a little bit larger proportion of all enrollments. So they seem to have done a little bit better at retaining the K-12 enrollments this year. However, in their own forecasts, the charter office is forecasting a flattening of their enrollments in the next 3 years. Thus, we could be expecting that their proportion of all enrollments might likely flatten out over time. So when we look at the district school enrollments, or non-charter, I should say, non-charter enrollments, we can see that I will say that the district is a kind of maintaining their proportion of all enrollments. So that gives us some sense of when we break it out into a charter, non-charter look at things. Each was affected by COVID, and each had similar grades that were impacted most by COVID this year. If we look at the annual percent change in enrollments for specific grades, we see that overall the greatest declines this year were in the elementary grades. Here we see that the change in enrollments from year to year have really been in the negative for a number of years, but to varying degrees each year. However, most significantly, we can see that the kindergarten enrollments dropped very substantially. For the graded enrollments, and this is for both the FICS and the non-charter enrollments, this is total enrollments, we see that we had a over a 12.5% drop in kinder enrollments as compared to the previous year. The state is reporting approximately over 13% drop in kinder. So because our district represents around a quarter of the state's enrollments, you can see how the enrollments at LAUSD impact what's going on at the state level. However, we did seem to hold a little bit better than when we look statewide at kindergarten enrollments. But also notice here that each of these grades I show in this chart, which is kinder, 6th, and 9th grade, are we could call incoming grades. So the kinder is showing enrollments coming in to the system. at elementary level. The sixth graders typically are entering into the middle school levels, and ninth graders typically entering into high school. And these are the grades that seem to have taken the biggest decline in enrollments during this school year. But looking at this is one way. How did the enrollments change from year to year? But when we are trying to assess, even though we are in a period of declining enrollments, there is this other component, which is how well are students progressing through the grades, through this system from kindergarten to 12th grade, because that also affects how many students are showing up the following year, or in this case, 4 years later, or 5 or 10 years later. So in our office, we do, in trying to understand what the enrollment patterns are, we do take cohorts of students and compare them against a later cohort of students. And this just to give us some sense of how the district is retaining students, or how these students are progressing through the grades, or at least grade levels, elementary to middle to high school. And what we can see here is based on past trends, and we can see that generally we have had an improvement in retaining students. Generally, we see that earlier in the earlier years, which is the earlier 2000s back to the mid 1990s, we are doing a little better at retaining our students, as the first graders coming through as 12th graders, as 8th graders, middle schoolers coming through as 12th graders. So in that regard, we are glad to see that the programs and policies that LAUSD has been working on over years seem to be resulting in improvements in terms of keeping the students that do enter the system. We are, though, looking at how these retentions, or I should say progression through the grades, in some cases were affected by what we right now are considering something that COVID did affect some of these kinds of progression through the grades. And in here we can see elementary first grade turning into 8th grade some years later. So this is our just one of the ways in which we are trying to understand how COVID has impacted enrollments. As those of you in education may know, kindergarten is, as I just said, very much dependent on births 5 years earlier. So whenever we are looking at, especially the incoming grades, we also are looking at a historical pattern. The state projections, and if you saw Walter Schwarm, he was saying, well, it looks like we are going to continue to have declines, or very less steep declines, but still nonetheless our birth rates are not going to rebound anytime soon. So for us at the LAUSD, that is, for us, we are looking at, okay, we have to plan for smaller enrollments as the years go by, but the retention does allow us to be able to plan for some keeping of those kids who have entered into the system, into the K-12 system. I thought I would just show you a sense of how our office is looking at the trajectories, our forecasted trajectories of the K-12 enrollments. Like many other public and private sectors, the long-lasting impacts of COVID have yet to be seen. But our early indications are there's going to be some degree of effect on enrollments. At this point, we are forecasting that the enrollments are generally going to rebound, maybe not 100% to what we would have expected in prior years or last year's forecast, but we are expecting a pretty high degree of rebound. We are also, for planning purposes, in our our high, mid, and low trajectories. We are expecting that we will continue to decline, and that is with COVID or without, but we will continue to have enrollment decline. However, the planning assumptions that we are using include not only shifts in population, but also the success of the district policies and development of new programs and policies in retaining the students as they progress through the years, so that the degree of decline can be modified by being able to retain a greater percentage of the students who start out as kindergarteners. The mid-trajectory is really where we will be moving forward in our planning. You can see there's some the moderating factors that will lessen the degree of decline out into the outer years. But again, as with many of the speakers we saw in the workshop, we're still waiting to get the data to come in more fully. The next time we will have a snapshot will be in the fall. In September, we will get another snapshot and see what's happening with the enrollments. At this point in time, it's a return to school model. We are assuming that there's going to be a high degree of students returning to school. And so as part of that, we are looking at what opportunities lay ahead. The district has decided, and each district across the nation is making their own decisions on these. The district will be opening schools fully next school year. However, the district will maintain the option for hybrid learning. So the online learning component will remain. That was, overall, that was a fairly successful venture this year. The district, not that there were not inequities, not that there were not performance differences, and access to a full level of technologic connection, but the district was very active in providing hardware for linking families up with internet types of connections, open to working with families locally at the local level and also at the central office level to help to ensure that at least there was some degree of connectivity so students had the opportunity to get online. What's coming up for LAUSD? Well, okay, we have an opening up of the economy. This is potentially an opportunity for the district. We have federal investments that, if gets passed, would be very much supportive of job creation. How does that affect families? The district is looking forward to families being employed or parents being employed, increasing the federal funding for education. Another opportunity is, again, the hybrid learning. Another opportunity would be the continuing to modernize facilities, and that is what we're doing. So we would have improved our modernized types of facilities for students. We are improving our retaining the students that are already enrolled, and universal pre-K. So the state has legislation that it should be voting on and making final votes on this coming week or two to provide universal access to pre-K education, which means before kindergarten, so 2 to 4 year olds typically. So the state has legislation that it is putting into effect. The local board of education for the LAUSD has voted on a resolution to provide universal access to pre-K. That is an opportunity for the district. I think that families who are going back to work and looking for those types of affordable childcare that we heard about earlier from the private sector side, my view is that it very likely that type of private, or rather that type of publicly funded pre-K childcare and education, that the private sector will be benefiting from that. And so that's an opportunity for public education. What kind of challenges lie ahead? Well, there are many. Right now, we are keeping our eye on the statewide trends, what the DOF, Department of Finance, is projecting for birth rates. We are very much interested in what has been a negative or very low net migration. Again, you don't have to travel very far in order to travel outside of the LAUSD boundary. So those are other issues, very localized types of moves that where families move outside of the LAUSD boundary. Well, the outmigration, we just heard about it, the outmigration of private companies and the talent. Those are big challenges for the public school districts. Lack of housing, cost of and the high cost of living, really low affordability in the LA region and the SoCal region in general. How do we make sure that we have the technological support for the types of hybrid learning? There are inequities in the access to technology and understanding of how to use the technology. Managing facilities. Well, we have declining enrollments. The facility build out and the modernization has been needed, and it has been addressing pent-up demand. So, but now we are in an era of declining enrollment. So we are looking at, are there going to be school sites where we will have to figure out ways to either manage very small enrollments, or does the district close that school for the time being? How are we able to, with our budgets, manage facilities? Including schools going to be open for in-person learning. How do we make sure we have socially distanced learning and are following state and federal guidelines on how to keep students safe during this COVID pandemic? Also looking at community usages of our facilities. Do we open up more facilities for these kinds of multi-use agreements? So in terms of our current forecasts, we are perhaps being a bit more optimistic in terms of we will get back to a more expected kind of trajectory. However, with the new DOF projections on births, well, we have to be mindful of that, and also how is this COVID going to really shift our current assumptions on our forecasts. We also have been keeping our eyes on particularly the live births that are occurring among residents who live within the LAUSD boundary. It's one thing to have general information on the state level. It's another thing to have general birth trend information on the county of LA. But since we don't serve the entire county, we have over the years developed a way that we can identify where the births occur within the LAUSD boundary. And that's really where we have had great success in seeing how the births occurring within the LAUSD boundary are taking slowly but surely a smaller proportion of all births happening within the LA County as a whole. So that has, so for us, this more localized view on births that have occurred and their relationship to the kinder enrollments has been very helpful for our office in developing our forecasts. So we can infer we're just going to continue with a downward trend of fewer births, and which will translate into fewer enrollments as migration locally and out in and out of the state seems to be picking up. We are looking at how that is going to continue our downward trend in enrollments. We also are keeping in mind that demographic shifts are shifts, right? In the long term. So the question is, okay, when do we start to see that little uptick in enrollments, because we are seeing some shifts in population and economic policy and trends. So unfortunately, I don't have that kind of crystal ball. But I will say that indeed we have been impacted by COVID. Our expectations are we will get, either through hybrid learning or in-person learning, a large proportion of students coming back. I will say this, and this might be part of our discussion today, there was an uptick in homeschooling this year, not just for the LAUSD, but that was statewide. They were reporting on that. So I have questions about how permanent that might be. Families using either homeschooling or private schooling. It doesn't seem to have upticked on the information I've seen from the CDE. So I don't know that private schools have really upticked or will uptick in their enrollments, but I am keeping my eye on the homeschooling and then with this hybrid learning or independent study. That's another factor that we do need to keep our eye on. So in summary, we have seen the COVID disruptions in our K-12 enrollments. We do see historically, we've had the troughs and peaks in enrollments. So at some point, I'm expecting that to arrive again, a little more of a upward trend in enrollments. But as you saw, not for the probably at least 5 years, we will not be seeing significant upticks. The independent charters, as well as the non-district schools, were affected by COVID. The independent charters did seem to fare a bit better than the district schools, but they also have a smaller population, and there's other dynamics happening between independent charter and district schools and the populations they serve. Our own forecasted trajectories are based on returning to some degree, and to a large part, a higher degree of what we have been seeing as the major influencer of trends prior to COVID. But next year will be will be the year where we will get that much more information that we really need to see what the impacts are long term. And we see both challenges and opportunities ahead, and in that sense, whatever lies ahead, as public education providers and as public servants, we must address whatever challenges, whatever opportunities are ahead, because that is our job, and the importance of having the best interest of our next generation in mind. And who are they? They're the voters. They're our workers. They're our home buyers. Dal Myers loves to point that out, and he's absolutely right. They're our Social Security taxpayers. And they really are this nation's hope for the future. So as public servants, we absolutely must invest in whatever lies ahead. And in that regard, we can open it up for discussion, because I'm sure there are many different perspectives on what that actually looks like to provide service and also to invest in our next generation. So with that, I would like to open up our roundtable for some discussion. Oh, good. I see some more people have joined. Lyle, have there been any questions in the chat? Oh, here we go.
I haven't seen any chat questions come through just yet. If there is anybody in
I see. I'm sorry, I got direct messaged. So
okay.
let me look here for a moment, and then I would like to open it up and people have the opportunity to open their mics up. There was one question: is this data available for fix as well? What inputs are included for your forecast? I don't know if I answered that in my presentation. Is that the independent charter data is data which is actually the way that we get it, and that brings up a whole bit of conversation. In fact, let me stop sharing here. That brings up conversation about how independent charters can or have the option to report directly to LEAs or versus not report to the local educational agency and just report directly to the state. So frankly, we are at the point now where we wait for the official state numbers to come through in order to be able to see what the independent charter data or enrollments look like. So we, at this point, are always operating with old charter data. We have last year's data. We do not have access to the most current school year charter data, and that unfortunately is really not beneficial for a more data-driven kind of analysis. To what extent has federal policy, if any, with the new administration affected demographic shifts? Well, that's a big question. I don't think I can answer that fully as of yet, but what I will say is, in terms of funding and in terms of a willingness to fund education, there has been a shift in national policy, in federal policy. We have to see how that all plays out. The shifts in immigration policies also, I'm expecting those to have some impact on our enrollments in the longer term. I do think that with a more openness towards some level of immigration, that may indeed bring in some more K-12 aged populations into the LAUSD's boundary. Although, of course, we have this very challenging time where the cost of living is pretty high. Trying to find affordable housing is a real challenge, and perhaps even more than it used to be. Now, I have a question. Does the LAUSD have any data on where families of school-age children are relocating? Yes and no. The state of California does have a statewide system which is meant to provide a unique ID to a student and then follow that student through their career. In fact, they're working on a enhanced system now, which would even track a student through their college careers and out into the workforce. But unfortunately, that it does not permit individual local education agencies to be able to track the students that were enrolled in their district or their agency once they have enrolled elsewhere. So I think it's too bad because it does, it's a black box. Oh, okay, they're no longer enrolled in our district. Where did they enroll? We don't really have that kind of longitudinal access to the data. So I would say what do we know about it? We probably know as much as SCAG knows, as much as the state knows in terms of where are people migrating to. I do reach out to other school districts, so I get confirmations, yes, of Nevada, of Texas, the kind of flow between Texas and even Los Angeles. I mean, I say Texas as a state, but there seems to be a more heavy flow between Texas and California. But not only, for us, the question isn't just populations in general where they've migrated to or where they're relocating to. It's also specifically those households that have school-age children. So we can have a growing population in LA or within the district boundaries and still not have an increase in enrollments because the people moving in may not have school-age children. Okay, I think I've answered the questions that were presented to me. I would be interested to know, for those of you in education, can you offer any insight into what you've experienced, and perhaps you could talk about where you are involved in education. And I can't see, I don't know who among you is involved in education, but would somebody open their mic and offer some insight? Victoria, your mic's on, it looks like. No. Well, would anybody like to talk about any part of any sector you're involved in? I'd be interested to know what is it you know about how COVID has impacted whatever sector you're working in. Would anybody be willing to start the conversation? It's a round table, folks. Imagine the round table. Somebody go.
We did get one additional question in the chat. It was, has job access been a point of interest to inspect as an input to forecasted shifts?
Well, let's say, Charles. Now, Charles, I'm going to ask you a question. You've asked a number of questions to me. So I'm going to ask you, in which industry are you coming from? And, oh, Anaheim. Are you with the city of Anaheim? Can you,
Hello. Yeah, this is Charles with the city of Anaheim. I'm a planner here, and I work with our advanced planning team, specifically at demographics. And I've followed this specific roundtable as much as I could because I do get requests from different school districts in the area for projections as well. And so most of our projections or data that's been requested is really just housing and new commercial construction, which is sort of related to employment and, those two main factors, housing and employment. And so I was just curious to know, with the school districts in LA, how much or what kinds of inputs are included in your forecast that, obviously affect more on the parental side of children. And, again, the sort of idea that families are moving out of California or out of our school districts. So I was just curious to see what your thoughts were.
right. Well, actually, okay, thank you. I'll answer that. But then I have a question for you also. Really, our projections focus on other than the kindergarten projections, we have to look at the birth rates and then have a 5-year offset to help us forecast for the incoming kindergarten. Now, with this universal pre-K legislation and resolution that's been passed, we are now going to have to be projecting for this incoming TK set of students who will be flowing in. But really once they're enrolled, we have more of a focus on how are they progressing grade to grade. We do not have a model which brings in migration or job shifts into our model at this point. What we are looking at next, which we think is really going to give us a much better way to analyze even locally within our own district, is getting a much better handle on the housing developments that are occurring within our boundaries. We have a couple of enormous developments in planning. The Warner Center, which is proposing thousands of housing units. Well, we don't know if those housing units are the majority of them are 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom. We are pursuing that. Downtown LA has been an interesting area because they've had a tremendous amount of readaptive use and transition into housing. And even we had a developer who was proposing a development that would include its own charter school. So there are these kinds of dynamics happening around the housing industry that's where we think that that's where we are now building our housing database relationships with the city a little bit more strongly. So as far as jobs, we don't have a model that brings that into our forecasting methods. However, I will say that when we look at our forecast from year to year and look at the enrollments coming through, we're very accurate in our forecasts. As with any kind of forecast, and when you're dealing with statistical analysis in general, the smaller the population size, the more error it gets exaggerated, and the harder it is to forecast for those smaller populations. And we have that challenge as well when you're looking at it. It's one thing to forecast on a district-wide level with over 500,000 students. It's another on a school-by-school basis where you're dealing with perhaps 400 students, or you're dealing with even 1,000 students. So that's where our best efforts are being put, is to look at our school-by-school projections and make sure we're understanding what's going on in those areas, and also bring in the housing component, so we're a little clearer on how many students new housing might generate. Charles, I have a question for you. You say you have your school district is coming to you for information?
Yeah, as part of the yearly enrollment projections, I forget what form it is required by the state, but yeah, essentially the different school districts do ask different jurisdictions on the housing development, Anaheim being one of the larger cities in the state. We have a lot of development, and so we're constantly changing lots of new projects. And so I'm always constantly having to keep up to date with what's going on here. And it's been a really interesting sort of data request, because it is so focused on housing and potentially non-commercial development. But what I've been looking into a lot more recently is workforce development and possible impacts of how much funding is going to workforce development, and is our ability to provide for a different, or raising your economic status, how does that sort of affect some of these issues that we're talking about today with these projections? Are we what else should we be investing in to handle some of these concerns, like families moving out? What really would help them? Would it be more, obviously we know that more affordable housing is important, but also what I'm starting to see is the types of jobs, longevity of jobs is another really important factor that that I personally have not been looking into for some of my work, but I'm starting to hear and see that economic development really is a tool, workforce development, to help different social statuses grow, which would likely, in my opinion, assist with retention. So that's something that I'm interested in looking at in the near future.
Yeah, and just to clarify, are you saying the state reaches out to you to ask for Anaheim's enrollment projections? Is that
just our local school districts? We have Anaheim Elementary, Anaheim High School, Union High School District, and
Yes,
a couple other districts that border our jurisdiction.
Yes, and who are smaller, so probably don't have the staff to really produce all of that information and be able to integrate it into their projections as fully as perhaps people think that the LAUSD has much staff and plenty of time and money. But sometimes, we have a staff of 14, but only about, well, there's me and maybe someone else who's really working on the projection side of the business. So even in larger school districts, we're challenged with what you're talking about, these, trying to gather the data, but also have all of the staff power to process the data. And that in itself is a challenge. I was interested to hear in today's one of the panels talking about how many of these large companies are relocating outside of California, and I wasn't quite on top of that one. I do think this universal pre-K is an interesting part of the formula or what we should be watching in this next period of time, because as I said, I know that the issue of childcare is, along with housing, along with having finding work, the issue of childcare is also quite a mover in terms of if people are going to decide to stay or to migrate elsewhere. I think this universal pre-K, and I think one of the reasons for it is to provide that kind of support, which is, all right, people are going to get back to work and they need to have somewhere for their youngest of children to be cared for. And I think that the district is looking at it in that way as well, let alone the educational outcomes seem to support that you get kids, particularly those who are of lower socioeconomic status, into these programs or into preschool programs. The outcomes are better, their educational outcomes are better. But I'm taking some notes on that, Charles, and on the workforce development side, I think that's a great thought there. How about anybody else, or anyone else who's in government who has something to add to what Charles is talking about, or in terms of?
Not quite in terms of what Charles was discussing, but Frank Wynn from SCAG asked, given significant decline of school enrollment in the last 20 years in LAUSD, are there any closures of schools in the last 20 years?
Hi, Frank. Long time no see. No, very few. There have been a couple, but really the policy has been not to close schools, and particularly not to sell off properties. We are not allowed to sell off properties any longer. And I tend to think that's a better policy than in the past, when the school district did sell off properties, and then the enrollments increased, and there it was, we were stuck with no property. And then trying to find property that's large enough and suitable in terms of environmental impact and all of that is challenging. And I can tell you that from when I started working at the school district and they were involved in trying to find properties for their building program, not easy to find properties that are suitable for schools. No school closures. However, that is the talk in our office is, okay, There are going to be areas, and we're already seeing signs of it, where the enrollments are getting low enough that we need to be asking ourselves, can we, from the facility side of it, can that site continue to be operating? And because the district has been in, tight budgets for the past many number of years, there are certain what do I want to call them, baselines that are being established for whether or not a site would continue to remain open. So not yet, Frank. Maybe next year I'll have I'll report on some closures. I don't know yet.
Great. Well, we are at time. I believe it is 4:46 now. So if there are any last minute questions, feel free to email them. I know, Mary, you had mentioned your email address at the beginning of the presentation. Would you mind mentioning it again, just in case people have follow-ups?
Yes, and feel free to reach out with questions. And the other is feel free to reach out if you're just want to exchange knowledge or have any ideas. We'd be happy to float those with you. I can be reached via email at Mary, M-A-R-Y, PRICHARD @lausd.net. And here I will type it into the chat. There you go. Otherwise, yeah, feel free to, even if it's not for me specifically, but those of you who've joined, if you do have questions or just want to exchange ideas, we're open to that.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary, for participating today in our roundtable. We appreciate your presentation. And we also just want to say thank you to everybody that attended the 32nd annual demographic workshop, and have a safe and hopefully cool afternoon. It's pretty warm out there. So.
And stay well.
Yep, exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.